Now, the other thing that's unique is that those first three Gospels take place almost exclusively in Galilee. Almost exclusively. The other three Gospels only present one story of Jesus coming to Jerusalem at his time of ministry. Only one time, and that's at the Passion. He comes and has the Last Supper, and that's the only time the other Gospels mention that Jesus is ever in Jerusalem. But John's Gospel, John begins a completely different way. He doesn't tell us about the birth of Christ. He doesn't tell us about the beginning points in that sense. He starts with a theological understanding. He wants us to understand why Jesus is doing what he's doing. And so he starts in a very different place. John only records one time that Jesus goes to Galilee. Every other story is in Jerusalem. Every other story. He tells us that Jesus is at least three Passovers. He has this story of Passover. He'll tell us again in chapter 5 and once again in chapter 11. He has him at another Feast of Tabernacles later in chapter 5 and in chapter 7. He's in Jerusalem over and over. Only one time does John account for something outside of Jerusalem. So there are always people who go, hey, that's pretty inconsistent. But most historians, when they sit down to write a book, they write a book based on what hasn't been told yet. And so as John begins to write his gospel, he writes from a theological perspective, but between the Galilean ministry of the first three Gospels and the Jerusalem ministry of John, we get a very complete picture of how Jesus ministered and what he was about and how it worked. And so it's a very strange thing, this cleansing of the temple here in the front. It's as if John wants us to understand some things about Jesus and about his ministry that theologically he wants us to understand the why of it all. And so he places this moment because it is a break from the past. It is a statement that says the old way of doing things is not going to be the way it goes in the future. That God is doing a new thing. And all the old rituals and all the old religion are not going to hold up under this new system. And so right in the beginning, think of the symbolism of this moment. Think of what he says. Think of the mentality of what's going on. He comes into the temple and he cleanses the temple. He chases out the money changers. And he says, I don't really like what you've done to my Father's house. I don't really like the way it's going. I don't like what happens to people when they come here. I don't like the way they feel. I don't like the way they think. I don't like the way the process works. I don't like anything about this. I want to stand for something besides this. And they ask him this question. Think of the power of this at the opening of this gospel. By what authority do you do this? And Jesus says, I'll tell you what. Destroy this temple and in 3 days I'll build it again. And Jesus is thinking of a whole different thing. They're thinking about religion. It took us 46 years to get this thing built. So you guys think, 2 years into the process of trying to add 3,000 square feet to our sanctuary is a big deal. It took them 46 years to get it built. And they just taxed the congregation. They didn't, there was no voluntary giving or nothing. They just taxed everybody. But Jesus was talking about his own body. He's already foreshadowing what he stands for. He's already foreshadowing. Can you get the contrast that this big edifice of a temple, this great religious structure, Jesus is cleansing it and saying, tear it down. I'll build it again in 3 days. He wants us to understand. And this is what I want to talk to you about just very briefly. This is a very short sermon. I know you don't believe it. Actually, it's very short on material. I'm not sure it'll be short, but it's very short on material. I think this is what John wants to understand. Jesus is not about ritual. He's about reverence. And he's not about religion. He's about relationship. I want that to sink in for you. He's not about ritual. He's about reverence. And he's not about religion. He's about relationship.